Welcome to the sixth episode of our weekly Al-Monitor webinar series on the Israel-Hamas war and its impact on the region. I'm Andrew Parasiliti, president of Al-Monitor. Our guest today, joining us from Israel, is Ambassador David Satterfield, who, following a distinguished career in the Foreign Service, was the director, Baker Institute for Public Policy at Rice University, before he was asked by President Biden last month to serve as US Special Envoy for Middle East Humanitarian Issues. We're going to get right into it, David. I know your time is short. Let's get started and begin with a reminder to our viewers to send your questions via the Q&A function on Zoom. David, again, welcome. It's great to have you here.
Thanks, Andrew.
David, there are reports this morning that we may be very close to a release of perhaps dozens of hostages in return for a pause of 5 days or so, provide what your colleague, Middle East Coordinator Brett McGurk, said a few days ago would be a surge of humanitarian assistance. Could you please advise on where this all stands at this point and what this all means for humanitarian assistance in Gaza?
Sure. Andrew, I can't comment. I think you'll understand on the timing of any potential hostage release arrangements. What I can say is this: following on Brett's comments in Bahrain just a few days ago, we do see a hostage release and the attendant pause or ceasefire as a critical opportunity to move in as much humanitarian assistance as possible into Gaza. It's assistance, it's fuel for delivery of the assistance, fuel for the water networks, the desalination plants, the bakeries, the hospitals in South and Central Gaza, and other essential humanitarian functions, all of which have been sustained by efforts on the part of the UN, by us, by cooperation with Israel, and critical cooperation by the government of Egypt, which need to expand dramatically. We must, all of us, take advantage of a pause in the fighting. And when I say us, I don't just mean those regional parties that I referred to or the UN. It's the international community. There is a $1.2 billion global appeal for humanitarian assistance to Gaza, whether in kind or in cash. That appeal needs to be responded to in a much more active and aggressive fashion than has been the case to date. We have an opportunity to do more. We must do more. And this could be the opportunity, should be the opportunity to manage that.
David, how are you measuring success for the humanitarian efforts, given the intense bombardment and ground campaign in which, according to the Ministry of Health in Gaza, that's led to over 11,000 deaths, mostly women and children?
Andrew, there are two dimensions or two sets of metrics here. The first is on provision of basic survival things, medicine, food and feeding materials, potable water, sewage maintenance. That's critical. It's being sustained at a minimal level. We have the ability. We have been working aggressively over this past month, since 21 October, when assistance resumed into Gaza through Rafah, to be able to maintain a minimal survival level. But that's not enough. More has to be done beyond that. And the more means restoration or resumption of some form of commercial life. It's flours for bakeries, it's cooking oil, it's stores with items on their shelves again. Now that has to come in tandem with humanitarian assistance. We have mechanisms that can make that possible. They require the closest possible interaction between different moving parts in Egypt, in Israel, and by the UN and commercial actors within Gaza itself. But the potential is there. That's one metric. The other metric is the manner in which Israel's campaign is conducted is of enormous importance. We strongly support the objective of this campaign, the ending of the Hamas governance of Gaza and its ability to project a threat which it has stated since October 7th, it would exercise again and again and again against Israel. That has to stop. We support the campaign, but we have been explicit, and every US official, from the president through Secretary Blinken, Brett, and I, have reinforced how the campaign is conducted must be done in a manner minimizing civilian casualties to the maximum extent possible, deconflicting humanitarian areas. Now, it's easy to say that as a doctrine. It's difficult in this campaign environment to do. Hamas has, since 2006, built its own military terrorist infrastructure in, around, under civilian and humanitarian facilities. It did so with deliberate purpose to make it more difficult for any campaign to eliminate its power to succeed, to count on the fact that the horrific images, and they are terrible, which come out of Gaza. Secretary Blinken has spoken many times of the gut-wrenching feeling as a parent he gets in seeing children pulled out of rubble, parents mourning. How could you not feel that way? But it is the consequence of a deliberate intent by Hamas to use civilians in Gaza as shields. It does not, however, justify anything other than the most carefully done, carefully thought through campaign by Israel. It's hard, but it needs to be conducted in the most disciplined way fashion possible.
David, question here. How would you describe Israeli cooperation on humanitarian issues? And also, if you could, in your answer, describe the concept of safe zones and is Israel abiding them?
Yeah. We started out on October 8th with nothing, not one pencil, not one drop of wood or drop of fuel, loaf of bread entering Gaza. That was the Israeli position. It's the message which Secretary Blinken heard when he came to Israel on the 17th of January, just after my arrival. But look at where we have moved now. 1,200 trucks have entered Rafah. That's not enough. That's the president's own word. It's not enough. But it is a critical start. We have been working, all of us, Egypt, the United Nations, UNRWA in particular, the Israeli government, the Israeli military, on setting up a mechanism that will allow, in a predictable, sustained fashion, a much greater volume of assistance to move into Gaza, and with the potential for commercial shipments to resume as well. All of that started from below zero. More has to be done. More will be done. The Israelis have been vital cooperants in this, as has Egypt, as has the UN, whose sacrifices, over 100 staff killed in Gaza, are extraordinary, but in the face of which the UN continues to act in absolutely exemplary fashion in conducting its vital mission inside Gaza. Now, safe zones. What is needed now, and where we and the United Nations are in intense discussion with Israel, is how best to establish what I would call practical arrangements on the ground that provide spaces which are less at risk, which you can consider as deconflicted from current or potential combat, into which individuals and assistance for individuals can go. It is not a meta concept of a zone. It is pragmatic, practical deconfliction areas that are in areas proximate to existing UN shelters.
David, I want to pick up on your answer there. I have another question that flows from what you just said. One of the areas of increasing concern is the status of humanitarian deconfliction in Gaza between the IDF and humanitarian organizations. Over 100 staff have been killed. Can you please elaborate a little more detail on what efforts the U.S. is taking to create that deconfliction mechanism? And is Israel being cooperative?
Sure. Andrew, over the last 48 hours, following several tragic incidents in which there were attacks and lethalities suffered by humanitarian agencies, we realized and we impressed upon Israel that more had to be done. There needed to be a single, coordinated, functional deconfliction mechanism It happens in other areas of conflict. It needs to happen now. Israel has taken those steps, and I believe that deconfliction mechanism is very shortly going to go into action. It is tragic that there had to be deaths before this was done, but the important thing is Israel does recognize the need and is acting.
David, Israel has had concerns at points regarding the delivery of fuel into Gaza. Some has been allowed recently. Could you comment on the issue of fuel? What is the list, and is there a list of other dual-use items currently restricted or banned for entry?
Andrew, fuel is absolutely critical to all of the humanitarian activities taking place inside Gaza. You can move 100, 200 truckloads or more of goods to the Rafah terminal. But if there isn't fuel for the UN to move those goods to destinations, it does no good. You can't have desalination plants, bakeries, water and sewage pumps fail because of lack of fuel. Communications networks fail, as occurred last week, for lack of fuel. It has to come. The fuel that was within Gaza after October 7th was exhausted. More, as you note, is now moving across every day. That needs to continue, and quite frankly, the volume of fuel needs to significantly increase for these essential functions. We do not see, nor do the humanitarian actors with which we deal, have evidence of any significant diversion of the humanitarian assistance or the fuel for humanitarian purposes that has moved, whether from within Gaza or into Gaza from outside, since October 21st. This is something Israel, the IDF, watches closely. We watch it closely ourselves. This has been a successful undertaking in every sense. With regard to other items on prohibited lists, this is something we in the international community, the UN agencies, work with Israel on to ensure that the maximum number of goods that are needed for humanitarian purposes are able, in fact, to enter.
David, who is controlling the Rafah Gaza entry point? And if Hamas is doing it, how does that square with Israel's concerns about destroying Hamas or objectives of destroying Hamas?
It is Hamas which controls the Gazan side of the crossing. Hamas has, for its own reasons, chosen not to interfere over the course of the past several weeks with the movement of assistance into Gaza, and arrangements were reached which permits both our people, American citizens, LPRs, their immediate families, and thousands of other foreign nationals not associated with the US to exit through Rafah. But the issue of Hamas's presence adjacent to or in Rafah terminal is a matter which will have to be taken up in the future. For now, arrangements do work to get aid in and to get people out.
David, if this hostage deal is finalized, would you consider that a vindication of the administration's strategy towards Israel, that is strong public support and private push on hostages and civilian harm reduction?
Andrew, we want to see those hostages, our own hostages, and we have them as well, including children, as well as the Israeli hostages and other third country nationals taken up in this Hamas sweep. We want to see them released for the sake of the hostages, their loved ones, their families. We have worked hand in glove with Israel and with other parties that have influence over Hamas to see this achieved as comprehensively and as rapidly as possible. And it's not a question of vindication of strategy. It is the right and necessary thing to do.
David, coming back to some of your earlier comments on international support for the humanitarian efforts, How valid are suggestions in reporting that donor quantities, I should say, are insufficient? And if true, why is that so?
They are insufficient, Andrew. The goods that have come into El Arish are almost entirely from the Arab world. Now, the majority of which, some 70%, is from Egypt itself. And there has been enormous generosity there, but the kinds of material that are needed have to come from the broader global community. And that has not come at the levels which we would have hoped. Why? I think in many cases it is because of concern by donor states as to where the assistance they provide will go. They're concerned as well about Hamas taking, diverting, seizing assistance. But our message has been, and I'll take this advantage to repeat it again, is that we believe, our Israeli interlocutors believe, the work done by UNRWA, by ICRC, by World Food Program, by the other non-UN affiliated NGOs operating, Médecins Sans Frontières, all of them have done an extraordinary job of the highest level of competency and care under extraordinarily difficult circumstances. And we do not have available to us evidence of any significant diversion or seizure of the assistance that has gone in since the 21st of October. That's the message the international community needs to hear and needs to understand.
David, Assistant Secretary Leaf the other day mentioned both Egypt and Qatar as vital in both the mediation efforts and overall diplomacy. Could you comment on their role, one, in mediation, and two, in your work supporting humanitarian assistance?
Andrew, I'll turn to the latter part of your question first. Nothing that has moved into Rafah could have happened, could have moved without the active engagement and support of Egypt. The highest levels of the Egyptian government, the Egyptian Red Crescent Society, which runs the El Arish hub, that's the sole humanitarian mobilizing hub for all of this aid. Egypt has played a central, vital role and continues to do. With respect to Qatar has played, as has Egypt, a very important role in the dialogues, plural, which we hope will produce the release of hostages. And I won't comment beyond that. Both have played a very important role.
Relief organizations say the Rafah border crossing alone cannot handle the volume of aid that is required to address the humanitarian needs in Gaza. To increase and expedite aid delivery, is the U.S. pressing Israel to reopen the Kerem Shalom crossing for aid distribution?
Andrew, we believe that Rafah, which it is true, was not designed primarily for movement of goods. It was for pedestrian and small vehicle traffic. We believe Rafah, with the appropriate mechanism, a mechanism we have worked with Egypt, with the UN, with Israel to set up and to implement very shortly, can indeed handle, through different types of arrangement, the volume of assistance needed. Kerem Shalom, as a point of crossing from Israel into Gaza, is closed. The Israeli government has made very clear that it is not prepared to see that change.
David, there have been reports that Hamas has been interfering in some of the humanitarian efforts, including the imports of food, fuel, and other items. Can you comment on that, please?
Not to our knowledge, and not as reported by any of the humanitarian actors in Gaza.
David, there have been talks, and there's increasing demands among some members of Congress and certainly in the Arab and Muslim world for a ceasefire. Is a ceasefire at all part of the conversations right now between the U.S. and Israel?
A ceasefire, as Secretary Blinken, as the White House and NSC have said, in the context of hostage releases, is very much an operational concept. But a ceasefire standing on its own is not something which our government supports. It would only allow Hamas an opportunity to relieve the pressure for the release of hostages. And that is not something we wish to see.
But you talked about the roles of Egypt and Qatar. There have been statements, including from the United States, about the role of the Palestinian Authority in a post-conflict situation. Can you comment two parts? One, what role has the PA played until now in diplomatic and humanitarian efforts, including specifically your work on the humanitarian side? And two, what is the current state of thinking about the role that the PA could play in post-war Gaza?
We have laid out parameters, broad parameters, for how we envision the day after, as it is referred to. Those parameters include the following points. There must be a Palestinian voice, a Palestinian decision over the future of Gaza and the West Bank. There cannot be separation again of West Bank from Gaza. There cannot be an attempt to address the day after in Gaza without addressing the day before, the day of, and the day after in the West Bank. There needs to be a role for a revitalized Palestinian Authority in all of this, as the future of both Gaza and the West Bank are contemplated with the goal of a Palestinian state embracing each of them. We've been quite clear on this. Now, the modalities of how you get to that point, what specific responsibilities there may be for the international community, for the region, on reconstruction, on development, on assistance, on security, all of those day after questions need to be addressed before you get to the day after. And that's something which we are working with our partners in the region on right now. But we absolutely do see and have identified that role for a revitalized Palestinian Authority in the future of Gaza and the West Bank. With respect to the assistance efforts, we are working in parallel with what we are trying to do in Gaza with regard to humanitarian assistance, and also see that the West Bank, that the Palestinian Authority has the resources it needs, both humanitarian and monetary, to be able to sustain its key responsibilities towards its people.
David, is the United States government in direct contact with Hamas regarding humanitarian efforts, and how
we are not in direct contact with Hamas, a terrorist group, on any issue.
There's a question here about Chinese engagement in the region, diplomatically and otherwise. How do you see Chinese involvement, both in diplomacy, and have they been involved at all in humanitarian issues? And if not, in any meaningful way, what would the US like to see China's role be?
Andrew, we'd like to see China's role in this issue, in this region, as we would around the world, be a positive one, not an opportunistic agent of negative change or worse. China has not been a material diplomatic contributor to any of this, not in New York, not elsewhere. The Chinese, on a negative note, have sought, as they do everywhere, to take opportunistic advantage of circumstances in which they can portray the United States in a negative light and advance their own interests. Nothing new here. The Chinese do this everywhere. But in terms of substance, as opposed to theater, nothing.
David, you're there in Israel. How concerned are people there about escalation on the northern border that could indeed even draw in US forces And how does that impact your work on humanitarian issues?
Andrew, I'll make a couple points, if I may, on the situation in the North. First, we believe, the United States profoundly, Israel believes, there is no inevitable or necessary escalation or war. This is a situation where the risk is of miscalculation, that Nasrallah believes he understands what the rules of the game are in terms of the attacks that he unilaterally launched across the border into Israel. Attacks which, I have to note, have grown deeper and have hit have hit civilian targets, not just military targets, and are then responded to by Israel. This is a risk, but it's a risk that doesn't have to continue. There is no decision for a war. There may be no intent to see a war come on the part of either the supreme leader or Hassan Nasrallah. But if this ever more aggressive series of strikes into Israel continues, then the risk does come of a mistake, a miscalculation. And that's something that needs to be stopped now. With regard to what the U.S. is doing, the U.S. has counseled both sides. Amos Hochstein was just in Beirut, was just here in Israel yesterday, trying to work with the Lebanese government and with Israelis. As the Secretary of State, the President, and other senior officials in the U.S. government have done to try to assure that there is no inevitability to escalation, much less to conflict.
David, a question. There's been a lot of differing reports in the press about Hamas's engagement in some of the key hospitals which have been targeted by Israeli forces. How do you see the picture there in terms of the hospitals, Hamas's role, and Israeli targeting?
Jake Sullivan, I think, has spoken publicly most clearly to this, and I will not go beyond his remarks. We have of our own origin compelling evidence, and have had for some time, of Hamas's use of hospitals, Ashifa Hospital in particular, for command and control, for terrorist, for militant purposes. And our evidence is ours, but it leads to one conclusion, and one conclusion only. It was the conclusion we drew before this campaign began. It remains our conclusion. Hamas has used humanitarian facilities as cover for its own terrorist military activity.
David, further question on Amos Hochstein's visit to the region. He's, of course, been involved with economic and energy integration efforts in the region prior to October 7th. The issue of integration has been part of both the president's comments and other senior officials. How do you see the post-conflict situation with regard to long-standing Biden administration initiatives around integration?
Andrew, I believe the engines driving Israel and its Arab neighbors towards greater integration, economic, security, population, tourism, remain very much in place. The common threat posed by Iran hasn't gone away because of what happened on October 7th and the Israeli campaign. It remains. And that will continue to be a primary driver for the Arab states that have already entered into arrangements with Israel, and we believe for those states which have not yet joined. Has there been a deferral of some steps that might otherwise have been taken? Probably so. But does it change the motivations, the calculus involved? No, I don't think that it does.
I know your time is short. We're just out of time. Thank you for joining us today, and thank you for the important work you're doing on behalf of the dire humanitarian situation in Gaza.
Andrew, thank you, and thank Al Monitor for the work that it does.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for watching. These webinars will be accessible exclusively to Al-Monitor paid subscribers starting tomorrow. Stay tuned for how you can sign up for your expanded Al-Monitor Pro subscription. Thank you all.